Welcome back to the Buffalo Reformed Podcast. In this episode, I want to review just a couple of points from a recent debate between Ross Douthat, who's a Catholic New York Times columnist. He does a lot of good interviews, but he interviewed Doug Wilson. That's how I was first introduced to him. And a cognitive scientist who's an atheist named Steven Pinker. The proposition in the debate that they were addressing was the question, do we need God? Douthat was in favor of the proposition, and then Pinker was against, naturally. And the debate is part of an ongoing series of debates called Things That Matter, and it's hosted by CBS News. And I'll put a link in the description so you guys can look into that if you want to. Should be interesting. They're trying to frame it as issues that are currently shaping America and American civil life, particularly politics. So, just briefly, overall first, I thought Douthat did a great job. He was explicitly Christian throughout the debate. It was his task to be Christian in the debate, and I thought he did that well. He accomplished his goal. He articulated, as a Catholic, I thought, many concerns that confessional Protestants share. Many of the critiques that we would hold against an atheistic understanding of things, he was able to articulate those very clearly. And so I was reminded of the fact that we may differ from Rome on very key doctrinal issues, but when it comes to civil society and the public square, Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, Protestants, we generally agree. Christ is king over that sphere. And a society that recognizes Christ's kingship and constitutes itself in relation to Christ's kingship under him, that those are healthier societies. So this is a good reminder and something that I want to lean into here, that it's good for Christendom to unite when we are addressing the public square. When we are dealing with things of civic importance as a nation, a Christian nation, then Christendom should be united in our efforts to combat atheistic secularism. And Douthat did not shy away from explicitly Christian language, speaking of the operation of the Holy Spirit and treating Jesus' resurrection as a real event, a historic event. And it was refreshing to hear that in a setting that, we're talking about CBS News, so in a setting that prefers naturalistic or purely pragmatic accounts of religion. It was very refreshing to hear that. His answers on sexuality and patriarchy even were not far, I don't think, from what confessional Protestants would iterate. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But just as a side note here, questions of how God's moral law should be applied in a particular society are and should be matters of ongoing debate within Christendom. So this is one of those areas where Catholics and Eastern Orthodox and Protestants may have varying degrees of agreement. But in my opinion, the best thing would be for all of those groups to come together for discussion, mutually beneficial discussion of how best to apply God's moral law in our context. So just by way of example, let's consider the Westminster Confession of Faith. The Westminster Confession and Catechisms are a historic and Reformed and Protestant account of how God's law should be understood and obeyed. And this is what I would hold to. This is what our church would affirm at Covenant Reformed Church. And yet, as I'm saying, that Protestant perspective maybe could benefit from a dialogue with Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox to get that perspective at least. I'm not saying that we would change what we believe, but it could benefit from having a broader discussion. Asking the question, how do we apply the law of God in our own time and place? And before we look at a couple of specific moments in the debate, let's just consider this. The Old Testament laws given by God to Moses in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy are an example of doing exactly what I'm talking about. God gave the Ten Commandments to Moses, and then Moses spends the book of Deuteronomy expositing those 10 commandments. Famously, Calvin organizes his understanding of the book of Deuteronomy around Moses giving an exposition of the 10 commandments. And Jim Jordan has followed that same approach in his lectures on the book of Deuteronomy. So this is just to say that for that time period, which was roughly 1500 BC, those case laws that are given throughout the Old Testament, throughout the Torah, that's their functional civil law, the judicial application of God's moral law to that particular nation in that particular time. And the Westminster Confession explicitly says this. In chapter 19, it says, quote, "To them also, as a body politic, he gave sundry judicial laws, which expired together with the state of that people, not obliging any other, now, further than the general equity thereof may require." End quote. And in other words, what that's actually saying is that those judicial laws are no longer binding to us as Americans, but the general principles that are undergirding those civil laws are binding, because those are reflective of the moral law of God, which is the same in every time and place. The enduring principles of the case laws that were given to Israel in the Old Testament are the principles that are undergirding those are still true today, and it's our duty as Christians in our context to figure out the best, most Christ-honoring way that we can take those principles and apply them in our own context. And just to give an example, which is widely used as an example for this, if in that time and place, Israel was required to have a railing around their roof because that was a place of social gathering for them in that context. And so this is exactly the same reason why we have building inspectors. That's the civil authority. That's the civil authorities who are enforcing proper care for our neighbors in terms of how we build and how we care for other people. And it's an application ultimately of the sixth commandment. So the general equity of the law that required the railing around the house is that we have to think about other people whenever we are establishing a structure that other people are going to use. We have to consider that this is going to be safe and not cause undue harm. And part of the role of the civil magistrate is to make sure that those things are actually being followed, that corners aren't being cut, which will then result in potential harm to the community. That's an example. So our context, 3,500 years later in America, it's very different than the context that Israel was in. But the moral law of God does not change. So we must exercise wisdom in how we seek to apply the moral law of God in our society for the good of society. And I'm arguing here that this conversation would be better if it was among Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, and Protestants, all the different branches of Christianity, having this conversation, being present in the public square, seeking to influence public civil life in the United States of America, which is supposed to be a Christian nation. If these groups came together, the Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholics, and the Protestants came together, all the different branches of Christendom, I think that could have a real meaningful influence on American public and civil life. So the reason for doing an episode like this, it's, in my mind, it serves as a reminder that the battle line for us as Protestants needs to be not against other Christians when it comes to public life. It needs to be put in the right spot. We need to make sure we're drawing the battle line in the right area. I know many Christians who would say that the number one enemy of the gospel is the Roman Catholics. And I understand what's driving them to make that claim. If they believe that a proper understanding of justification is ultimately what is going to affect somebody's eternal destiny. But that's not what I have in view here. And this is not what many who are advocating for public engagement in America, particularly for American Christians, that's not what they're talking about. We're not talking about compromising the gospel. We're talking about, do you think that it would be better if less abortions took place in the United States of America? And if the answer to that is yes, then we should be okay with working with Catholics and Eastern Orthodox to influence public opinion and public policy so that less abortions take place in the United States of America. That should be true. Do you think that it would be better for public schools either to not receive public funding or to give a more favorable picture of Western civilization to the students that they teach? I think most Roman Catholics, most Eastern Orthodox, and most Protestants would all say, yes, we want the public school system, if there has to be one, to teach a better, more appreciative view of the West than it currently is doing. Those are things that we can align with these people on very easily. And I would argue that once we're kind of coming to that civic table together and we're working together for the betterment of our society, that's going to be the context where we can have gospel conversations with people who I would say are Christians, but we need to continue the debate about justification and about penal substitutionary atonement and about salvation by grace alone through faith alone, our Protestant distinctives. We can maintain those Protestant distinctives while at the same time aligning with our what we would consider to be errant Christian denominations, brothers and sisters, as we together seek to influence society. In my opinion, that is the best way for us to look at the situation we're currently in, and it will ultimately have the best effect on society and will allow us to have better conversations with people because we're starting on common ground already. We are living in a Western society that has forgotten who it is. And there has been major institutional decline in the West. And secular humanism interprets that decline as progress. But Christians, all the branches of Christendom, should resist that framing and call for a return to the West's Christian foundations. It is precisely because of the West's long Christian influence that something like a secular humanism could even exist. It's a distortion of the older conviction that every human being is made in the image of God. Let me explain. Because we are made in God's image, we are inherently valuable. We would affirm this. The Torah affirms this. Genesis chapter 1 and 2. We're made in God's image, and therefore we are inherently valuable. But the modern secular narrative that is based upon that claim twists that into, I'm so valuable that whatever I can conjure as true for myself must be true. And when that happens, any attempt to call people back to reality gets dismissed as Western colonialism, and it's repressing their truth. So in that kind of environment, we need to be reminded that Catholics are actually on our side when we call for a return to the West's Christian roots. And from that shared point, atheists and secular humanists can be answered more effectively. Because even their ethical ideals are operating inside a fundamentally Western and therefore Christian framework. So all of that to say, we need to remember who our friends are, and we need to get to work together to rebuild Christendom. And then from within Christendom, we can have these, some might quibble with this language, but I would call them intramural debates about substitutionary atonement, justification, baptism, all those things that do need to be discussed and are important. We just need to remember who our allies are whenever we are trying to call Western civilization back to its Christian roots. The first point, and I'm not going to go through this exhaustively. It was a 50-minute debate. It was very excellent. I would encourage you to watch it. I'm just going to pull out a couple of points that I found interesting. We're going to talk through them because I find them helpful for understanding and for approaching the modern secular mind and how they think about Christianity and a lot of the assumptions that they have. So the first point we're going to look at is Pinker makes the claim that God is not the source of morality. So in response to the opening question, which was, are we better off without God? Is society better off without God? Pinker says this.
Third, God is not the source of morality. The God of Scripture slaughtered innocents by the millions, commanded his people to commit mass rape and murder, and prescribed the death penalty for blasphemy, idolatry, homosexuality, premarital sex, talking back to parents, and working on the Sabbath, while finding nothing particularly wrong with slavery, rape, torture, and genocide. Now, Ross is trying to persuade everyone, it's in the subtitle of his book, to believe in this God.
So the task for you and I as believers is to be able to articulate how, on the one hand, God can be portrayed as so antagonistic to modern human rights. And yet, on the other hand, we can maintain the claim that Christian ideals are the very foundation of the West's human rights tradition. How do we bring these two things together? How would you answer this critique by Dr. Pinker? Western civilization was the first civilization to abolish slavery on principled, universal grounds, and to develop liberal democracy as we know it. How do these two realities then, the one that Pinker is describing, and these facts about Western civilization, how do they come together? How should Christians make sense of that tension when they hear a critique like Pinker's? And I would encourage you to try and think through that. The critique being, and just to reiterate, that all these evil things we see God doing in the Old Testament, this is from their perspective, all these things that are being done in the Old Testament, genocide, murder, torture, rape, he says, that this is the same God who supposedly establishes human rights. This God violates human rights at every turn in the Old Testament. This is the critique. So how do you answer that critique? How do you respond to that? Pinker would have you believe that your God is not what gave us morality and human rights. He would say that human progress gave us human rights. And he's trying to prove that the God of the Bible could not be the source of Western morality. But the point of contention that I would like to address here, and this is the way that I would frame this, is to recognize that this is actually a metaphysical claim. If God created the universe to operate in accordance with certain principles which find their source, both for their origin and continuation, in God, then does it not stand to reason that when creatures in that universe live in accordance with those principles, that this leads to flourishing, and when creatures live in discordance with those principles, that this leads to decay and death? Does that not follow? God is the source of law. He's not subject to a law that is higher than himself. The law comes from God, which is a direct contradiction to Pinker's statement that morality does not come from God. So if we truly live in such a world wherein rebellion against God and the principles he has established result not only in naturally difficult lives and ultimately premature deaths, but they may also result in temporal judgment, then that list of wrongdoings that he listed, they don't appear to us in the same light. If God does exist and is active in the affairs of men, then when a nation becomes evil in its dealings, worships demons, sacrifices children, persecutes the people of God, then God would be just in sending another nation to judge them. So when Pinker says that God was slaughtering innocents by the millions, he is not recognizing any meaningful morality by which we can judge that a nation is worthy of destruction. Nor is he recognizing that God cannot commit murder. God gives and takes life. God is not constrained by his own law. He is arguing that it was immoral for God to destroy those people without addressing that, one, if God existed, then Pinker would have absolutely no standing by which to judge such a higher being. And two, that those people, by the standard of their creator, were not innocent. And three, that God is the source of the law and is not subject to a law that is higher than himself. Okay? So one, if God exists, then Pinker has no standing to pass judgment on a being that is so immensely higher than himself. And two, the people that he says are innocent, by God's standard, by their creator's standard, are not considered innocent. And three, that the law by which we judge human affairs is not a law that is higher than God himself. That law comes from God himself. So God is not judged by a law higher than himself. He's not judged by a standard that we can hold God to. That's not how that works. The law proceeds from God. We proceed from God. So there is nothing higher than God. God is the standard. So from that perspective, God cannot commit murder. God cannot lie. He cannot break any of the Ten Commandments because the Ten Commandments are a reflection of who God is. But if we just take a step back and realize what Pinker is actually expressing here, he is assuming Christian morality, and then he's denying the source of that morality, while at the same time trying to impose his human understanding of morality on the theoretical God from whom all reality emanates at all times, which makes absolutely no sense and is an incoherent critique of Christianity on its face when it's evaluated in the proper light. So let me just restate this just to make sure that we're all on the same page. Pinker is saying that God violated human rights, but the only reason we have a concept of human rights is because God created us with them. And so then Pinker is assuming that human rights exist, which is an inherently Christian perspective. And then he's passing judgment on the God that created human rights, as if that God is able to operate outside of the system that reflects who he is. In other words, Pinker is assuming Christian morality, and then he's denying the source of that morality, while at the same time trying to impose his human understanding of morality on the theoretical God from whom all morality and reality emanates at all times, which makes zero sense. It's incoherent. It's not a true critique of Christianity because it's not. It's assuming its own first principles. But let's contrast this with the appropriate view. So in God's creation of mankind in his image implies the inherent dignity of every person. As our own founding documents put it, we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. But one of those rights is not the supposed right to rebel against the Creator, either directly or indirectly by denying his revelation of himself in both nature and in the church. In our godless version of the West, with its inherited forms of Christian morality, including the inherent dignity of every person, many now assume that rights simply mean anything that I want to do. If you deny me the right to do what I want, then you are oppressing me. On that logic, I should be able to kill the baby in my womb or sleep with whomever I want because those desires are recast as human rights. The Christian response is to say, no, you never have a right to rebel against your Creator. True rights are a gift from God, ordered toward loving Him and loving neighbor. They're not liberties that we can use to despise His law. There is no right to sin against the one who gives rights in the first place. If rights don't come from a Creator whose law defines love of God and neighbor, they will inevitably be redefined as the right to do whatever I desire, even when that desire directly contradicts the law that once grounded those rights in the first place. So let's use an example to just make this more clear. Imagine you build a Lego world that somehow comes to life, and you tell the Lego people, you all are given the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but you must not go beyond these 10 rules, these 10 commandments, as you use your liberty and pursue happiness. Okay, so you've created the Lego people, you tell them you have life, and now you can use your liberty to pursue happiness, but you need to do that within the confines of these 10 rules. Over time, okay, we'll just say the Lego people forget you exist and they start to question whether those 10 rules really mean anything. They still talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but now they define those rights in ways that directly contradict what you, as their creator, originally commanded. This directly represents the state of the West today, as articulated by Pinker's answers to the questions during the debate. Our job as the church is to remind our neighbors why they have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the first place. It's because those rights were granted to them by their Creator in the very act of creation. And those rights were reaffirmed and redeemed when Christ paid for our sins on the cross of Calvary. God could have taken every human life in response to mankind's rebellion against him. Instead, he sent his Son to pay that debt so that we could live with true liberty and the pursuit of happiness, in peace with God and one another. Secondly, I want to discuss what was being cast in the debate as religious intoleration. And it's a very common critique of Christianity these days. And so I think it'll be helpful for us.
I want to get our next question from Chloe Valdery.
Hello. I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian family, and my parents disowned me for being bisexual. Today, I am not allowed to go to my childhood home. So, Ross, my question is for you. How do you wrestle with the fact that many people in this country, in the name of Christianity, are mean and unkind to people because of their sexuality? Thank you.
I think that the shortest answer is a version of what I said in passing earlier, which is that religious beliefs carry with them distinctive vices that are, again, different from some of the distinctive vices of certain forms of secularism and atheism. And those vices are connected to misplaced zeal and intolerance. And I'm very sorry that in your own life you have been a victim of those forces.
And I think Ross did a fairly good job of answering this question in a way that is appealing to people in our modern context. But he does seem to assume a framework of sexual liberation. He says that, quote, religious beliefs carry with them distinctive vices connected to misplaced zeal and intolerance. And I'm very sorry that in your own life you have been a victim of those forces, end quote. So he appears to take for granted that the treatment this woman received was wrong on its face because she was, in her words, disowned for living that lifestyle. From the modern Western perspective, her family's attempts to enforce their religious morality is automatically framed as oppressive. And for Dr. Pinker, that is inherent to religion itself, imposed morality. But as Doug Wilson has pointed out many times, this is not a problem unique to overt religion. Secularism also imposes morality. Those who, and just by way of an example, those who hold strongly enough to biblical convictions are frequently treated as intolerant and then disowned in their own way. And my goal in analyzing this question is not to nitpick Ross's answer here. I think he did a fairly good job. I do think that we would have some real differences when it comes to how we interpret what the seventh commandment means and how we ought to interpret that in society. But to help us think about how we would answer this question whenever we are approached by coworkers, by friends, by family members who have a distaste for Christianity because of negative experiences or associations with the church, that's why I'm bringing up this question. So how would you respond to a question such as this one? How do you wrestle with the fact that many people in this country, in the name of Christianity, are mean and unkind to people because of their sexuality? How do you answer that question? And this is where I think our earlier framing will help us. So many times, and I think many Christians feel pressured to answer this question immediately by addressing the meanness and the unkindness. But the inherent problem here is that their definition of mean and unkind are likely very different than our definition of mean and unkind. If she was a member of a church and then she brings her girlfriend into the church and then the elders exercise discipline in line with Scripture, that is not automatically cruel. It may simply be obedience to biblical teaching on sexuality. Yet if we say it that way, in a godless Western context, it cements in people's minds that the Bible is a bigoted book from a bigoted age and therefore cannot be trusted to define modern morality. And so this is why my recommended approach to this kind of a question starts with a hypothetical, which I view as a doorway for them to enter into Christianity so they can start thinking about the internal logic of how we think from the Scriptures and how we reason through these things. And so the hypothetical that I usually start with is this. If God exists and created mankind in his image and gave us 10 rules to live by, and then said, you have life, and now you have the liberty to pursue happiness as long as it is in line with these 10 commandments and the natural laws governing the world, then it stands to reason that certain ways of living are out of step with what God has revealed in creation and Scripture. So I want you to consider this example purely from a pragmatic perspective, okay, that assumes God's existence and his presence in our daily lives. So consider this. If you knew that smoking cigarettes undoubtedly leads to pathology, sometimes minor, sometimes pretty severe, would you be for or against smoking? Or if you knew that consistently indulging in negative thinking tends to lead to crushing depression or anxiety, would you be in favor of cultivating negative thinking? And I think the answer in both cases is obviously no. Are people free to do these things? Yes. But are there consequences to these lifestyle choices? Yes. Similarly, if we live in a world that God created as creatures of God, and we believe that the institutions God established, like the church, and the scriptures God revealed, the Bible, are ways God communicates himself, then living in accordance with that revelation is what leads over time to genuine human flourishing. So there are at least two ways to look at a situation like the woman's who was asking the question. One, either her family was simply trying to impose their own morality on her, resulting in her being disowned, and that's how the secular mind would think about that. Whenever you are imposing Christian morality, biblical morality on somebody, and then they leave, they view that as you disowning them. Or consider this alternative view. Perhaps her choice to live outside the revealed will of God meant that she, in effect, excommunicated herself from an institution that is trying, however imperfectly, to live under God's law. How you answer that depends entirely on whether you think God actually exists and has spoken clearly about what leads to life and what leads to death. If you believe that God exists and he has spoken, and he has particularly spoken about that issue, then you're going to be trying to live in accordance with it. But if you don't believe that God exists, or you believe that he hasn't spoken to that issue, then you're not going to have a particular regard for issues such as that. So, a couple of things to keep in mind, just some caveats with this. First, we don't really know whether her parents acted towards her in a fully appropriate way. We don't know. That's one reason why I don't really have a major problem with Ross's answer at that point. It's really impossible to ultimately judge the situation in its entirety without knowing far more details than we have in just that question. And second, it's also important to note that Christian parents who are walking with children who have homosexual desires, that's a very difficult situation. And it requires a lot of care and a lot of clear communication and right framing of ordered desire versus disordered desire. But if a child rejects God's definition of what is ordered and replaces it with a secular definition, we have to recognize that this is a metaphysical choice. They are choosing to live as though God either does not exist or does not care about this aspect of life, whereas her family clearly believes that God exists and he cares very much about it. So in that case, she is effectively, and this is very important to note, she's effectively demanding that her family forsake what they believe and replace it with what she believes. And if they refuse, they are labeled bigoted. So you can see that they are doing the very thing that they're accusing Christianity of doing. They are labeling someone as bigoted, hateful, mean, unkind, because they actually believe something and live by it. And when someone disagrees with that perspective, they believe something differently and then live accordingly, they demand that their view be accepted. That is not very tolerant. But it is at least understandable in our age where people are not taught to be self-conscious of their metaphysical priors. They are not taught to think about implications of certain life choices. And therefore, as Christians, we must use wisdom and grace when we try to bring a gospel light on these situations. So in conclusion, I would highly recommend you listen to the entire debate with intentionality so that you can see that Ross is answering questions from a Christian and Western viewpoint. And Pinker is also answering questions from a Western viewpoint, but particularly a non-Christian atheistic one. And so I want to use that to emphasize we're living in a West that has forsaken its foundation, a culture that once knew that human dignity came from the image of God, now praises the erosion of its institutions as progress, all while still relying on the very Christian assumptions it publicly denies. So my contention in this episode is that a united Christendom must step into this debate and call the West back to Jesus Christ. And seen in that light, the battles over God, human rights, and sexuality are not isolated culture war issues, but they are coordinated fronts in a single metaphysical struggle, a man-centered universe versus the gospel of Christ, who is Lord over all.